My name is David Ezrati, and I'm a citizen journalist in Dayton, Ohio. I've been reporting on the culture of corruption indictment since the day the FBI came out and told us back on April 30th of 2019 that we had a culture of corruption and paraded 4 black men as the keys to this big, huge, masterminded, contractual brouhaha that they said more indictments were coming. I asked that day, could they only indict black men? And what about the $130 million that disappeared at Wright State, where there was an H-1B visa scandal and not a single person was indicted? Something didn't feel right. It was months until November when they plotted out 3 more people in the culture of corruption. 2 more black people, Joyce Cameron, who is the former mayor of Trotwood, and her husband, and Steve Rauch. Only people who've spent time in jail have been Joey Williams, who spent 3 months of a 1-year sentence, Clayton Lucky that spent about 4 months in jail, and everybody else paid some fines. The 4th black man that they brought out the first time was businessman Brian Higgins, and that case is still pending. Today, we learned that in all these investigations that there were warrants issued for Dayton Mayor Nan Whaley, going back as far as when she was a city commissioner and running with Ryan McLinn, who was the mayor. I've known they've had dirty money straight from the start. I pointed out back in 2009 that a man named Kit C. Cooper of Westerville, who was the owner of Vance Environmental, gave McLinn $10,000 and Nan Whaley $5,000, and nobody cared. Now they're talking about $100,000 from Rauch, and using the bag man of Willis Blackshear, who is now deceased. Also, David Clevenger, who was a city employee. Now, all this sounds pretty amazing, and it's made the news finally. But what hasn't made the news is a month ago I filed in federal court to get the FBI and the Department of Justice to hand over the actual tapes of Nan Whaley that were played to the grand jury. The FBI and the Department of Justice tried to use the excuse that grand jury testimony is always private, which is untrue. In 1987, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, when she was on the circuit court, said, when it's public officials doing things wrong, they don't get unlimited immunity. That case will take a while to make it through to the courts. The same judge that unsealed the second warrant did it a few weeks after I filed, and a journalist in Columbus picked it up. But everybody's still missing the big part of the story. And that part is when Commissioner Williams first became a confidential informant, that was October of 2015. He wasn't indicted until April of 2019. In 2017, he was allowed to run for office, working as a confidential informant, already having a plea deal and agreeing that he would resign if he got reelected, which he did in February of 2018. The FBI knowingly let a public official who was a criminal run for office, win an election, take office, and then bow out in the name of their big investigation. Houston, we have a problem. I suspect Nan Whaley had done the same thing, that she had become a confidential informant, and that's why she dropped out of the mayor's race and let Commissioner Mims step in at the last minute. Why she's running for governor can only be part of a FBI sting to get more people to donate money to her and catch them on tape, which I hope they do. But this continued fraud against the people has already cost us money. We had to pay for a special election where Darryl Fairchild narrowly beat Darryl Ward, the party's insider that they tried to get to cover things up. We have real costs involved when our democracy can't be trusted. How did I know Williams was a confidential informant? That's the real piece of news that's been skipped over all along. And that has to do with the first confidential informant the feds were using, which also shows up in the indictments today. Mike Marshall used to work for Steve Rauch. He was his right-hand man. At some point, he became a CI and started a company called United Demolition. It was Mike Marshall who was the one that took a large chunk of money and gave it to Rauch Winburn, who was the head of the Human Relations Council and son of Roland Winburn, a former state rep. Winburn took that money with the promise of trying to get contracts to Marshall's new venture, which was going to be a service-disabled veteran-owned business, minority business, to do demolition. They got one contract from the city and failed miserably at it, according to city records. But in order for that contract to have passed, it would have taken not just the vote of Williams, but the vote of 3 commissioners. Williams was in on that deal and was going to make a lot of money. And on the side, he decided to have Marshall build him a patio, which is what eventually got Williams indicted for. $40,000. Relatively chump change compared to the demolition contracts that Rauch has been reeling in for decades in this city. The real question was the demolition of the old Dayton Daily News building, which Rauch screwed up, and then left a hole in the ground and somehow ended up holding the historic part of the building. No one's ever been brought to task for that. In the meantime, Whaley and Dickstein, the city manager, have been going along just like nothing's going on and nothing's wrong, although they've been deep in the midst of this all along. The real question is Whaley doing the same thing as Williams? And why are we going to pay for it? Now, back to how did I know Williams was a CI? This is where it gets interesting. Because of the 4 defendants, the 4th one was Brian Higgins, a businessman who used to own Sidebar in Dayton, used to have the contract to haul dead bodies in Dayton, and before that in Chicago. And he's a licensed mortician and owns Quincy's Fish. I'm going to be honest about this. Brian is a good friend of mine and was a client. Brian handed over to me and to several other people his discovery, which is supposedly a big no-no. That's only for the lawyer and the defendant to analyze in order to prepare their defense. I published 3 pages of that discovery a year after the indictment, when the Dayton Daily News first figured out that Mike Marshall was a CI, something I published a week after they'd indicted the 4 black men. Those 3 pages are clearly Williams in his first FBI 302 file talking about various people in Dayton, including Marlon Shackelford, Commissioner Debbie Lieberman, and others. Nobody did anything about that until much later when Higgins sued Mike Marshall, the confidential informant, for taking $40,000 from Higgins to fix Higgins' house for an insurance claim and not performing. Higgins filed that in Judge Gerald Parker's courtroom, and the FBI had a cow. And they sent letters out to everybody who had it and told them to destroy it. But what's online is online. So I broke the story of Williams being a CI in 2020. It's been out there all along. The public has a right to know if the FBI and the Department of Justice are guilty of what's called misprisonment, which is failure to report a crime that they know happened. And the crime they knew that had happened, they charged Williams for after he'd run for office on a plea deal. Joey Williams went in on his own accord on April 30th and turned himself in. That was the day that his youngest son graduated from Stivers. It was part of the deal so that his son wouldn't be embarrassed by his father being a criminal. When he resigned as city commissioner, he said it was because his new bank president job took too much. The bank continued to pay him all that time until he was indicted. Another crime that went unreported. The FBI and the Department of Justice are just as guilty of a crime. And any judges that are putting up with this and letting the cover-up continue are just as guilty as those people they've indicted. The public has a right to know what is happening with our public officials when they're being corrupt, when they're taking bribes, when they're awarding contracts. And as a final reminder of how this affects more people than you think, my small business did work for a guy named James Kent, who was in my neighborhood, who had a great concept back in 2010. He started going and hiring ex-convicts to deconstruct homes so that we wouldn't end up putting them all in the landfill, reusing the building materials, and helping ex-cons get back on their feet. When it came time in 2013 for a $250,000 contract, his bid was ignored, and it was handed to some demolition company in Bellbrook that had only had a $36,000 bid on something else, and they kept extending the contract all the way up to millions of dollars. The City of Dayton Purchasing Department, the city manager that makes the recommendations, citywide development, which hands out money left and right, the Department of Planning, the commissioners, all are complicit in putting James Kent and his convict deconstructors out of work so that we could fill the landfill and the pockets of Steve Rauch, who, by the way, got a little fine and a tap on the back and say, "See you later." If this is the best the FBI and the DOJ can do, maybe we need a new sheriff in town. And it's not going to be the Dayton Daily News, Channel 7, Channel 22, Channel 45, Channel 2. They all ignored the story when I filed in federal court asking for these tapes. If you want to read more and see all the documents and see all the proof, it's all there for you to see. www.esrati.com. That's ESRATI.com. I also was recently threatened with a lawsuit by another investigation I conducted into the no-bid contracts being given to the Wilderness Agency, guided by County Commissioner Debbie Lieberman's assistant, who is now their Chief Operating Officer. You might want to look at that too, because the FBI and the DOJ, they don't seem to care. And I guarantee you, there's a lot more to find out if somebody would do the investigation. Thank you for watching.